Hello everyone, welcome back to the Anatomy Lab. Today we're going to be taking a look at the facial bones. So those are going to be the bones besides the cranial bones, the part that makes up the covering of the brain. The facial bones will be all of these kind of down here, which is going to be making up, as you maybe have guessed, your face. So to start off with, inferior to your frontal, inferior to your frontal bone, you're going to find your upper jawbone. So this up here, the one with like your teeth along the upper region of your skull, this is going to be your upper jawbone, otherwise known as your maxilla. So to be clear, you actually would have two maxillae bones, but they are going to be fused together along this ridge so that they kind of form one singular formation. So this together is going to be making up your maxilla with two bones. Now along the maxilla bone, underneath the orbit, you're going to have this small little hole. This is called the infraorbital foramen. So infraorbital is referring to the fact that it's going to be below the orbit or inferior to the eye socket rather. Now between the maxilla bones, you're going to also have this bone right here. This bone is called the nasal bone. The nasal bone is going to be, as you may have guessed, like where your nose extends away from it. So to be clear, your nose is not all bone. Only a small portion of your a small portion of your nose is going to be bone. And this is probably, if you wear them, where your glasses are going to be resting. So this is your nasal bone. Now, in the middle of your nasal cavity, you're going to see that you have this large kind of dividing structure between the left and right sides. This is called the nasal septum. And this would actually be made up of two bones here. You would have the perpendicular plate that extends inferiorly from the ethmoid bone. That would be this top portion. And then you would also have the inferior region, which would be the vomer, which is a separate bone. And furthermore, if you do look inside of here, you'll be able to see that you have these kind of ridges along the nasal cavity. These are called the middle and the nasal conchae. So these are going to be increasing the surface area of the nasal cavity to allow for additional filtering, warming, and moistening of the air entering your body. Now to the side of your skull, you're going to have the zygomatic bone. So the zygomatic bone is otherwise known as your cheekbone. So not your soft part of your cheek, but the upper portion of your cheek, which is the lateral portion of your eye socket. This is called the zygomatic bone. And what you'll see is that there's an extension of the zygomatic bone that will be going posteriorly towards the temporal bone. This would be called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So together with the temporal bone, this whole thing is called the zygomatic arch. But there will be the anterior region of the zygomatic arch, which is the temporal process, and that is going to be part of the zygomatic bone. Now, the inferiormost bone of the skull, this is called the mandible. The lower jaw is going to be the mandible and is going to have two major regions of this bone. That is going to be the body of the mandible as well as the ramus of the mandible. Now, furthermore, there are going to be specific landmarks that you should find here as well. So this right here is going to be called the mental foramen. So the mental foramen, a good way to remember the mental foramen is to try and think really hard about what you would do if you thought really hard. So try to do that right now. Like maybe you're doing it already. Like you might be rubbing your chin like this. Like if you're doing that, then you would know that this is the mental foramen. Now along the ramus of the mandible, you'll also have a couple of other landmarks as well. You're going to have the mandibular condyle. That is going to be this portion that will be articulating with the mandibular fossa. So you have a mandibular fossa, which is a depression that will allow for this to articulate it with it smoothly. This would be the mandibular condyle. And then anteriorly, you have a more pointed one. This is called the coronoid process. And then between the two, you have this kind of U shape. This is called the the mandibular notch. So mandibular fossa, coronoid process, and mandibular notch. So those are the majority of the facial bone structures. Make sure that you can identify them on each of the bones. Make sure that you can identify the landmarks specifically, and be careful of like all of the regions as well as the foramina. But besides that, I think that's about it for today. So good luck with your studying. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time.